To some scholars, the world's oldest source of wisdom is in India. This chant is part of a spoken encyclopedia called the Veda. It is at least 5,000 years old and may represent the oldest body of technical knowledge known to man, with references to television, atomic energy, and interplanetary travel. Committed to paper 400 years ago, it is still the target of intensive research by scholars such as Padmasri Sivaramamurthy, the director of the National Museum of India.
In ancient India, as all over the world, they had a desire to travel in the sky. We have the aerial car of the god of light, Surya, mentioned in the Rig Veda itself. We have also the Pushpaka Vimana, the wonderful aeroplane that could carry any number, mentioned in the Ramayana. A real aerial car managed by an engine. The rishis could transport themselves to any planet that they wanted because of their siddhi.
A force known as Sidli was said to exist in the world of the ancients. Using Sidli, they could transport themselves anywhere on Earth, into the skies, and finally to other planets. What was Sidli, and who brought it to Earth? If the tales and images of space travel were limited to India, they could be dismissed as the product of overworked imaginations. But how then could we account for primitive drawings in the rocks of Indio County, California? In the 20th century, we accept the existence of spacecraft. What event could possibly have inspired this 14,000-year-old drawing of a spaceship landing on the Earth? On a rocky plain in the Andes called Toro Muerto, hundreds of petroglyphs depict the same scene. Are ancient figures with spacesuit-like costumes the record of beings actually encountered? And where did the Indians of Colombia find models for these golden helmeted figures sculpted more than 1,000 years ago? The same people molded these golden objects, which look startlingly like a modern delta-wing jet fighter plane. Could flight have played a role in the construction of this rocky fortress in Peru? Called Ollantaytambo, it spans a pass through the mountains that link the jungle with the sea. The Inca builders were accomplished stonemasons who built a chain of fortresses across the Andes. Nowhere is there an explanation for the technology used to carry enormous pink slabs, each one more than 60 tons, from this mountain where they were quarried, across the river and valley, and then 10,000 feet up the face of Ollantaytambo. Could it be explained by a force known in ancient India as Sidli? Cuzco, once the capital of the Inca Empire, is a mixture of Spanish and Inca architecture. The walls of this street contain a stone that has 12 angles cut within it. So tightly do the stones fit that no mortar was ever used to join them together, and not even a knife blade can be slipped between the joints. The wall once formed a part of an Inca temple of the sun. The Spanish conquistadors used the walls built by the Inca as the foundation of a church. In 1950, an earthquake shattered Cuzco, virtually destroying the church. Today, the people of Cuzco are still rebuilding the church atop the ancient earthquake-proof structure. The original walls, however, remain standing. Again, the question arises, did the Inca receive this building technology from the original colonists? The strangely knotted strings are called quipu. No one today can read them. But when the Spaniards first came to Peru, the Inca kings would call upon their rememberers who would consult the quipu and account for every kernel of corn and man, woman, and child in the empire. But the quipu were more than a numerical accounting system, for with it an accomplished rememberer could call forth epic poems, historic dates and events. The knots show how the decimal system was used, but added to them were colored threads that offered subtle nuances and shades of meaning that are forever lost to us. So sophisticated was the quipu, however, that some investigators believe it was the Inca version of a computer punch card. An enormous crystal was placed in a Mochica grave more than 1,500 years ago. It is among the hardest of all minerals, yet it was cut, polished, and shaped by a technology that theoretically could not have existed at that time. Other hands carved this skull. The British Museum calls it 15th century Aztec. But why would the Aztecs, who never created naturalistic art, suddenly render in crystal a skull? The bead is turquoise, another extremely hard gemstone. It is 1,700 years old and was probably part of a necklace or bracelet. The hole in each bead has a diameter of 0.19 millimeters. Even today, we can barely drill holes that small. The ibis is native to Egypt, but it was carved into an ancient stone printing roller found on the Pacific coast of South America, 8,000 miles from Egypt. These 1,500-year-old pottery figures form a portrait collection that depicts the races of man. All are separated by time and distance. And yet somehow the potters of an Indian tribe called the Mochica cataloged races they theoretically should never have encountered. An iron pillar was forged 1,700 years ago in India. It confounds the laws of metallurgy. Too large to have been forged in one piece so long ago, it is rust-free after 1,700 years. No less remarkable, although a mere 700 years old, is a rust-free iron tooth. Found in a Peruvian grave, it seemingly is as functional as any modern dental prosthesis. Other graves yield the suggestion that the ancient Peruvians were accomplished neurosurgeons. At the Cusco Archaeological Museum, Dr. Fernando Caballesi, professor of neurosurgery at the University of San Marcos, demonstrates.
These skulls here are just a very small sample of the tremendous amount of skulls that were found in the graves of the ancient Peruvians. I think that all in all, we have studied more than 10,000 skulls that have been unearthed. Now, these are some of the instruments that they used. This is called the tumi knife, which was used this way, just to open the scalp. This cannot be used in the bone. To open the bone, they used other bronze instruments like this, just to pry up the bone, like here, prying up the bone. There are some other odd instruments like this, just to make these indentations. And there are at least 2 dozen different other instruments that were used also. This one here is a very interesting specimen. It shows a very persistent surgeon. You find here that this man suffered 4 operations, and he survived every one of them. Either it was a very sick man or a very persistent individual who operated on them. But he was a very good technician, because after all, these areas, especially these two openings, are right over very, very dangerous sites that even right now, with all the techniques that we use now, we would just be very much afraid of operating in these sites. And this man really survived these operations. In Calca, near here, near Cusco, where about, I would say, 85% of these skulls show healed trephanations. 85% of survivals from skull operations is a pretty good and excellent result.
At the Yerkes Regional Primate Center, scientists implant monkeys with electrodes. The experiment stimulates the brain with radio waves and thereby controls behavior. Are today's scientists seeking knowledge already gained by similar experiments performed centuries ago? In 1947, a Bedouin boy found the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran. At least 2,200 years old, they bring us closer to the original Bible than any other source and contain clear references to holy ones descending from the heavens. While biblical scholars study the scrolls for their theological implications, other scientists have looked to the Bible for evidence of extraterrestrial visits to the Earth. An aerospace engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, Joseph Blumrich, has found in the visions of Ezekiel a technical description of a spaceship.
The prophet Ezekiel describes 4 encounters with spaceships. At first he saw clouds, fire, and he heard noise coming out from the sky, out of the north. And as the vehicle approached, apparently it came rather quite in his direction, he observed what he calls living creatures. What Ezekiel calls the living creatures had straight legs and round feet, or calf's feet, sometimes they're called. And it was the description of these landing legs that made me take the book of Ezekiel serious from an engineering point of view. I have had the opportunity about 10 years ago to work with my group in my office for the development of such a landing gear for an unmanned lunar landing station. For that hypothetical vehicle, we developed the landing gear and what we call the footpad, and what Ezekiel would call the round feet.
Translating Ezekiel into engineering terms, Mr. Blumrich had these artist sketches made of a landing vehicle supported by 4 helicopter units.
One of the interesting examples of Ezekiel's ability to observe and to describe are the faces he sees on these living creatures. He sees 4 of them, an oxen, an eagle, a man, and so on. They are located at the top of these helicopter units, and consequently they contribute to his impression of having some living creatures in front of him. What they actually are is quite interesting. Now, some helicopters, in particular in this case this one, needs protection, just some hood around to protect them against dust or weather and so on. And such sheet metal structures will have cutouts, will have humps in order to accommodate levers or rods which are below them. And they do have, they may have the distinct appearance of faces. We have a number of such face-like structures, like for instance the Gemini capsule. Then we have very interesting feature that looks like a monster, and every one of the audience will remember to have seen faces in rocks, in old trees and tree stumps.
Jericho was built more than 9,000 years ago. Here man has lived continuously for a longer period of time than anywhere else on the face of the earth. And here remains one of the most puzzling of ancient mysteries. Great walls 12 feet thick made the city impregnable. But Joshua called upon his priests to blow their trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. But how? One theory holds that an earthquake tumbled the walls of Jericho. An earthquake that was part of an enormous planet-wide catastrophe. Around the world are indications of great disasters that might have caused the gods, themselves colonists on an alien planet, to flee impending doom. Did their departure inspire all the myths of Atlantis? Could there have been several colonies, blurred by time into the one Atlantis first reported by Plato? Are legends, in fact, the histories of visitors from afar who colonized the earth? Plato told of a fabulous kingdom that was then more than 9,000 years old. Whatever fragrant things there now are in the earth, or woods, or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land, wrote Plato. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, varying the color to please the eye and to be a natural source of delight. They had such an amount of wealth as was never possessed by kings and potentates, and is not likely ever to be again. The entire area was densely crowded and kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices and din and clatter of all sorts, night and day. There were kings' baths, and there were separate baths for women, and to each of them they gave as much adornment as possible. There were many temples built and dedicated to the gods, also gardens and places of exercise. Over the centuries, the people of Atlantis apparently succumbed to the greed that seems eventually to afflict all civilizations. Their actions must have angered the gods, for Plato tells of Zeus calling them together to inflict punishment upon Atlantis. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. And here Plato ends his tale in mid-sentence. But the people of Atlantis had been warned, and they fled the island in haste. Then Zeus must have spoken, for the island was shattered by what may have been the most powerful volcanic explosion ever known. Immense tidal waves and earthquakes followed the eruption. Scientists dated the catastrophe at approximately 1500 BC. This same chronology coincides with biblical and other accounts from all over the world that speak of or hint at incredible natural disasters. In Plato's time, this island was known as Thera. Today it is called Santorini. Was it also once the site of the fabled empire of Atlantis? We may never know, but the ruins of some ancient civilization are here, buried under a 250-foot layer of ash and pumice that covered the island 3,500 years ago. Was this the end of the beginning? The moment when all advanced forms of technology and culture vanished from Earth? Could their destruction be remembered now only as myths? Might such myths extend even beyond the Earth to incredibly dim memories of catastrophes suffered on other planets? Light years from our sun, in the constellation of Bootes, there is a red giant called Epsilon. It is circled by a planet that may once have supported life. Some scientists believe that a space probe was sent from that planet toward the Earth. They believe the probe received these signals in 1927. They were the first radio signals sent from Earth into space. These echoes have a different delay pattern. There is no natural explanation for the difference. Duncan Lunan, of the British Interplanetary Society, has interpreted the echo pattern as a message from the space probe, a message from a dying planet in Epsilon Bootes.
The star has become what we call a red giant. If we look at this painting here, it can illustrate the point. What has happened is that the star has exhausted its reserves of hydrogen in its core. In this situation, the inhabitants of the planetary system would find themselves in real danger. Their own planet would get hotter. In time, all the planets would get very hot. They would have, in other words, to perfect first interplanetary and then interstellar travel in order to get away from the sun. So the probe then came to the Earth. It came to the solar system. It located the Earth. It came into orbit around the Earth, and it began looking for signals, radio intelligence signals from Earth that would indicate the presence of intelligence. All the star maps, all the diagrams that I've interpreted as star maps, seem to confirm this indication that it was about 13,000 years ago that the probe got here, and it had finally been activated by our radio signals in the 1920s. Was it doing it because it was signaling home that it had been activated? If so, and if there's anyone there to hear it, perhaps in about another 150 years we could expect to hear something from these people. It's possible that in the course of our history and in the last 13,000 years that ships from Epsilon Bootes have come here, have conducted survey missions, possibly even had small settlements established here for a time and pulled out again.
It is possible that visitors from Epsilon Bootes arrived 13,000 years ago. Perhaps a city in Peru, abandoned 3,000 years ago, was the base. It once held 100,000 people. Why did they flee? We will never know, for they left nothing of themselves, no trace of their presence, except a silent city of mud walls. Might they have been colonists recalled to base in the face of an impending catastrophe? What happened here, on this windy plain, halfway between the sea and the sky? The only witness is a mute stone god who looks out at the ruins of a once great civilization and weeps. It has been estimated there exist 50,000 civilizations, more advanced than the one we know. If only one of those civilizations saw its sun dying, it could have seeded the Earth. Someday, somewhere in the galaxies, we may encounter life that is remarkably similar to ourselves, and we will be able to confirm that the faint traces of ancient mysteries are the imprints of our ancestors from space. Man has been in space since 1957, when the Russians first orbited a grapefruit-sized satellite called Sputnik. Since then, men have walked upon the moon and lived in laboratories that orbit the space between the Earth and the moon. Soon we shall reach out to the other planets of our solar system, and then to the stars. But even before men ever dreamed of space travel, they reported on visitors from space. And to this moment, the reports continue. Are the most recent UFO sightings evidence of continued alien interest in the Earth? Is someone in space still watching the descendants of a colony sent to Earth thousands of years ago?